Story 1. Prince of Persia on the computer and Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega console. Story 2. Doom on Disk Operating System box in Windows 95. Also Hexen Beyond Heretic. Story 3. I remember playing Space Quest 4. I have since returned to the series many times. I also remember Spyro the Dragon. Story 4. I played Frogger on Atari, Pac-Man, and Centipede. It would be years before I played another game system, and my first games then were Duck Hunt and The Legend of Zelda Gold version. Our platform progression was Atari, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega CDX, which I bought with my first paycheck when I was earning $4 an hour, and the PlayStation 1. Story 5. Sprinting race of the United States Olympics on the Atari 2600. Place the joystick knob in your palm and wiggle it back and forth as fast as your arm can go. Story 6. Tennis, which was a Pong clone, was on a Lloyd's Color Television Sports 813. Story 7. I am not 100% sure, but I think it is pole position on the Atari 800. Story 8. The Amazing Spider-Man disc I got from a Kellogg's cereal box. Story 9. I played Crash Bandicoot, Wrath of Cortex on my big brother's PlayStation 2. I fell in love with gaming and have been playing ever since. Story 10. It was an Atari. It had many games, but my favorite was a spaceship game. Fantastic. Story 11. It was a Sesame Street learning game on the original PlayStation. Story 12. Rad Racer and the original Super Mario Bros. Were defining moments of my life. Story 13. My dad was like a kid and always had to have the latest toy, so our first console was Pong in the early 1970s. Story 14. It would likely be an Atari game such as Adventure or Pitfall. Story 15. Grand Theft Auto, Vice City or Mortal Kombat 4, but I do not remember exactly which. Story 16. A knockoff version of Donkey Kong called Killer Gorilla for the British Broadcasting Corporation Acorn Model B microcomputer. Story 17. Super Mario World was my first video game, played on my uncle's Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I will continue this tradition with my nephew on my Nintendo Switch and teach him all the secrets. Story 18. Not the original Pong but a clone called Tennis on the snappily named Radio Shack electronic television scoreboard. Story 19. I remember Pong around the summer of 1973 in my local small-town United Kingdom television and electrical shop, while Bjorn Borg played at Wimbledon on television in the rest of the shop. The shop staff were happy to have two children showing off this entertainment wonder. Good times. Story 20. Spy Hunter 2001 on the PlayStation 2. I grew up on that, all-terrain vehicle off-road Fury 2, and Sly 2 and Sly 3. Story 21. Donald Duck's Playground on Commodore 64. Donald had to work various jobs to earn money and buy playground equipment for his nephews. Story 22. It could be a few games. Either an older Pokemon game, Duck Hunt, or one of the games on my PlayStation Portable or Nintendo DS. Story 23. Silkworm on a ZX Spectrum, which you had to load from an audio cassette. Story 24. I think it was Sokoban. It was definitely on my father's work personal computer. Story 25. Space Invaders arcade machine in a pub where we stopped on our yearly camping holiday in Wales. Story 26. I cannot remember which game it was. It was AZX Spectrum. There were so many weird little games. Story 27. Microsoft Pinball, probably. Or the good old days of personal computer website gaming. Story 28. We played Donkey Kong in an arcade in the early 1980s. The arcade name was Pie in the Sky. We used to put our quarters up to reserve our spots. Story 29. Either Tetris or Super Mario Land on the old Breeze Block Game Boy. Story 30. The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. The game hooked me immediately. My family never owned video games until the Nintendo 64. So I first played it at my cousin's house. Their parents were getting them a Super Nintendo Entertainment System for Christmas, but they let my brother and me play after they went to bed. Story 31. I'm sure there were some before this, but Jumpman was on my cousin's Commodore 64. Story 32. Mortal Kombat on the Microsoft Disk Operating System. but that memory is blurred with Super Mario Bros. On the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 33. I was about 4 years old when I got access to my mother's Nintendo 64 console. My first game was Majora's Mask because I liked the gold-colored cartridge more than the others. It is still one of my favorite games today at 19. Story 34. Combat on an Atari console was poor, so I did not play it much. It did not get real until we got a Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 35. SimCity. Jeremy, I was 4. How was I supposed to understand any of that? I already told you I like trains, damn it. Story 36. Playing Contra with my dad was always a good time. We never made it past the second stage, but we must have cleared the first stage at least 50 times. Story 37. It is one of those 3. Mortal Kombat 1, Mortal Kombat 2, and Mortal Kombat 3. I had them at the same time. Resident Evil 1. Jedi Knight. I cannot remember whether it is Jedi Knight 1 or Jedi Knight 2. Story 38. I played Gauntlet on the Nintendo with my dad while Rush played on the stereo. Story 39. The first games I remember playing are Tetris, Duck Hunt, and Super Mario Bros. 2. They were a combo on the Nintendo Entertainment System my brothers got a Christmas or 2 earlier. Their first game was Yar's Revenge on an Atari 2600. I just remembered the first game all of us boys asked for together was the Friday the 13th game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 40. Mega Man on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I do not know which one. I was about 4 years old. Story 41. Charlie the Duck, Commander Keen, or the original Duke Nukem come to mind. Story 42. I played Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit so much on the original PlayStation. Story 43. Jetpack on the Commodore Video Interface Chip 20. Good times. Story 44. I had to double check because it seemed like a fever dream, but it was called Bubble Ghost. You controlled a ghost who blew on a bubble and tried to navigate screens without popping it. Fans, knives, and other obstacles surrounded the screen and tried to pop the bubble. Story 45. It was a Lemmings-style video game, supposedly based on Disney's Dinosaurs, the one about some monkeys and dinosaurs migrating after a meteor struck Earth. Each dinosaur had unique abilities, like a Brachiosaurus that could turn into a bridge and another that could dig horizontally. When I was a toddler, I never got to finish it. Story 46. Aladdin 1993. I was a little kid and loved the movie, but my mom was very opposed to modern media. We did not even have a television at home. I watched television at my grandparents' or my father's house, and I was around 7 when I first visited a friend who let me play their video game system. It was a Sega Genesis, and the cartridge was already plugged in. I remember an immense feeling of power when I could control the little Aladdin on the screen. I felt intense joy. I must have died thousands of times in the first level. Eventually my friend came back and took his turn. That first hour with a video game is burned into my memory. Story 47. Gunsmoke on the Nintendo Entertainment System. We had the Nintendo Entertainment System before we got our PlayStation, and Gunsmoke is the only game I can remember. Story 48. Grand Prix for the Atari 2600. Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System was the first major game I really got into. Story 49. Christmas 1972. I was 5. I remember playing a Magnavox Odyssey home video game console at a wealthy friend's house that his parents had bought as a family Christmas gift. It was very primitive. It had no cartridges, could not keep score, and required taping a sheet of clear plastic to the screen for some game modes because it could not render backgrounds. I thought that a machine that let you control something on a television screen was as close to real-life magic as I had ever seen. Story 50. Ghostbusters on the Commodore 64. The first news story I recall occurred a few months later, in April 1986. Believe me, September 11, 2001, was nothing in comparison. Story 51. Parachute on a Nintendo game and watch if that counts as a video game. Story 52. I remember playing Sneak and Peek with my twin sister on the 2600. It was a 2-player hide-and-seek game. For the time and at my age, about 7 or 8, it was top tier. Story 53. It was on the British Broadcasting Corporation computer. I think it was called POG or something. It looked like an apple, but I cannot remember much else. Story 54. Two spring to mind. Buggy Boy and Enduro Racer for the Amstrad. Oh, and Mystery of the Nile. Story 55. Either Pitfall or Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. I got blisters on my fingers. Story 56. There was a personal computer game from the early 2000s. It was a first-person shooter with a point-of-view perspective. The character screams the word reload. I had to shoot my way through several buildings, and the final mission featured a big boss who threw barrels. I cannot remember the game's name. Story 57. I played Need for Speed Underground 2 on my older cousin's Nintendo DS. This was before I got a PlayStation 2 with Need for Speed Most Wanted. Story 58. Age of Empires 2. I used to watch my neighbor play it when I was 5 and became obsessed with the mods throughout my teenage years. Story 59. Bro, why is everyone saying Pong? You guys are ancient. Mine was Wii Sports. Story 60. The Indiana Jones game, or maybe Frogger on the Atari. I have clear memories of both, but I cannot put them in chronological order. Story 61. When I was about 5, I was at my mom's friend's house, and she had a son a few years older than me. He had a Nintendo Entertainment System and a bunch of games. I don't remember which we played first, but Super Mario Bros., Excitebike, Double Dragon, and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out were all in the mix. Story 62. A mock-up of Space Invaders in the early capitalist 1990s in Romania. It was a blast, played on a Felix 1024. The machine occupied a space the size of a penthouse inside a renowned aeronautical refurbishing factory. I was about 4 or 5 years old. Edit. English is hard sometimes. Story 63. At a Pac-Man arcade machine, I am being held up by my dad so I can reach the controls. Story 64. Sonic and Mortal Kombat on the Sega were the only games we had, but they were excellent. Story 65. Video Chess and Tunnels of Doom on the Texas Instruments TI-99, circa 1980. Story 66. Super Mario Bros. On a console and SimCity 2000 on a personal computer, the latter on a Walmart display computer. Story 67. A ladder on the K-Pro 64. A 64-kilobyte computer. You were the letter O and traveled along equal signs to the ladders, which were the letter H. It was kind of like Donkey Kong. Story 68. I played Duck Hunt at a friend's house, then played Contra after I bought my own. Story 69. Triple Action on the Intellivision 2 is a very immersive military simulation. Story 70. Surprised I haven't seen many Pokemon. It was Pokemon Red or Pokemon Silver, but most likely Red. I've never really thought about what the first video game I remember playing was. Laughing out loud. Story 71. There were a handful of games my grandfather got for me on an old Commodore 64 when I was 4 or 5. I remember one was Shogun and another was a medieval knight game. The music in the knight game was nauseating, but I enjoyed Shogun. I had no idea what I was doing. We had a large collection of floppy disks, and those two stood out the most. There were also California games, Frogger, Math Munchers, and the Oregon Trail, which we also played in school. Story 72. It was not really a game, but Microsoft Dangerous Creatures. Story 73. It was a downhill skiing game on my Apple IIe personal computer long ago. Story 74. Pixel Junk Eden convinced me to start gaming when I bought a PlayStation 3 after I retired in my 50s. Story 75. My first 2 games on a Windows 95 personal computer were The Duel, Test Drive 2, and The Lion King. Story 76. I remember the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 on the Xbox 360, especially because I thought the cover art was the coolest thing in the world at the time. Story 77. Super Mario on the Super Nintendo came first, but I want to mention Snake from the early cell phone days. It was not my first game at all, but it was revolutionary. Story 78. Combat. Story 79. Pong. I am almost 60. I think it was displayed on a television at Sears. My sister and I played. It was a simpler time. Story 80. Honestly, probably Bugsy the Cat or maybe Sonic. To me, they are from the same time period, and I was about 6. Story 81. Surprisingly, the old arcade game Bubble Bobble 2. Fuck, I feel old. Story 82. I was playing Joust at the arcade. My dad owned the arcade from 1982 to 1985. I was not quite 1 year old, and my dad held me to the controls and let me slap at them. I do not know why, but my memories of this are very vivid, and it is the earliest memory I have. Story 83. I remember when my older brother took me to see Pac-Man at a hotel. We were probably on vacation. Before long, arcades were filled with games. Story 84. Super Mario 64, Mario Party, and Donkey Kong 64 were all released around the same time. Story 85. I forgot the name of this Elmo game. I think there was a safari when you clicked the door. I also remember an activity when you clicked the painting. I did not know if anyone could find it. I found it. Create and draw in Elmo's world. It was not that hard to find. Story 86. It was either You Don't Know Jack or Battle Chess on an old personal computer. Instead of pieces, the game features medieval characters and a building that transforms into a golem. Instead of black versus white, it is red versus blue. When a piece or character is eliminated, the winning and losing pieces come to life and an animation similar to finishing plays, but the gore is replaced with cheesy comedy. Story 87. Pong was the first video game I ever played, and it feels so simple compared to today's titles. Story 88. Super Mario Land on the original Game Boy. I did not get very far and always preferred the sequel, which was probably my second game since I got them at the same time. The music is still stuck in my head to this day. Story 89. A knockoff of Pac-Man called Snapper on an Acorn Electron. Story 90. Pong on a console. Space Invaders in an arcade. My dad had to lift me up to reach the controls. Story 91. Tank. Pong. I was in total disbelief when I saw Pac-Man for the first time. I was 13. Story 92. My uncles used to let me play a car racing game when I was little. They had a cheap console my aunt bought in Italy. They kept it in their rooms and sometimes pretended to babysit so they could play. It took me a while to realize they had 3 joysticks and gave me the one that did not work. For men in their 20s pretended to cheer me on. They later introduced me to an older version of Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto when I was 12, so they redeemed themselves. Story 93. I remember Minecraft before it was a downloadable game. It was a pure sandbox with a small world of about 10 chunks in each direction. Story 94. Menor de Morteville, Lemmings, or some other game from that era. Story 95. Adventure came after Zork, but Zork was text-based, so it may not be considered a video game. Story 96. I think it was National Hockey League 96 on the Sega Genesis. My dad never took it easy on me. Story 97. At an original space-age designed arcade in the bus station, I played Pong. It seemed so futuristic that it blew my mind, and I became a gamer for life. Story 98. My father had a Texas Instruments computer. There was a game I think called Oil Driller or something like that. You had to connect a cassette player to the computer because the game was on a cassette. This was around 1983. I loved that game. Story 99. Who does not remember their first? Mine was Night Stalker on Intellivision. Story 100. Adventure on the Atari. I still enjoy playing that game from time to time on those mini nostalgia consoles. Story 101. I have not played Oddworld since, but I saw it in a video once and was flooded with nostalgia for sneaking onto my brother's PlayStation and trying to play it. Story 102. Pong on an Atari console with black joysticks and an orange button. Story 103. Something on the Atari, either Defender or Circus. Story 104. 1960s Baby J helicopter game. Took dimes. I played it around 1977. Story 105. Pong. When we did not have quarters to play, we would just stand and watch the simulation. Story 106. I am dating myself because I already had children in double-digit ages. The Apple II game called Sneakers. Did anyone else play that video game? Story 107. It came from the desert. LucasArts put out some belters. Story 108, Tetris on the Game Boy, followed shortly by Duck Hunt on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 109, Tetris on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Ports of Call on a home computer. Story 110, Adventure on the Atari is not because I am that old, but because my uncle had a bunch of retro consoles and games when I was a kid. Story 111, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Blue Rescue Team, either that or Blur on my cousin's Xbox 360. Story 112, both the Pac-Man and Dora plug and play joysticks are for the television. Story 113, I do not remember much about it. It was a game about nursery rhymes on a floppy disk. Story 114, Palm, Breakout, and Night Driver, all next to each other, were the standard 1970s coin-operated trio. Story 115, I played Age of Empires 1 when I was about 5 and learned the game from scratch over a couple of years. Story 116, an old Contra game on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System that my dad borrowed from his friend for a night. Story 117, oh holy shit. The first games were the Winter and Summer Olympics on the Atari 2600. It is a huge change compared to now. Story 118, you realize no one cares what your first video game was, and many people around the world work for companies that want to relate whatever you have typed on Reddit to age brackets for their artificial intelligence training. Story 119, Formula 1 Grand Prix on Microsoft Disk Operating System. My father was driving, and I was pressing the up arrow key as hard as I could. Story 120, probably Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System. I have early memories of playing many games on that system, including Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and some track and field games. Story 121, it was either Smash Bros. Melee, Mario Party 4, Mario Kart, Double Dash, or one of the Zelda games included on the collector's disc. Story 122, Halo, Reach. I believe I was 3 when I had my first memory of playing it, though I am not sure. Story 123, Unreal Tournament. I will never know why my parents let me play that as a child. Story 124, The Knights of the Zodiac on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I did not manage to play it properly. Story 125, I did not play Pong until we got an Atari. Asteroids and Space Invaders were the top games in the early days. Story 126, it was a dizzy game on the Commodore 64, but I do not remember which one. Story 127, either Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System or Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage for the PlayStation 1. Story 128, along with Super Mario and Duck Hunt, like many others, the other game I remember playing first was Rambo for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 129, I am pretty sure it was a Finding Nemo game on the VTech V.Smile. As for a real game, I played Diablo 3 with my father and his friends when it came out. I was 10. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.